Hi, everyone. My name is Ruben, and I'm the lead solution engineer at Storybook and Chromatic. Today, we're going to talk about the craft that goes into maintaining a quality design system, one that truly shines, the workflows in which you apply that craft, and how Storybook and Chromatic can give you superpowers throughout the process. Now, it's really tempting to think of the UI workflow as linear, but in reality, it's more of a loop. We go from design to handoff, then development, testing, and then review leads right back to design again. It's almost impossible to account for all scenarios up front. For example, as you go from design to development, you discover new constraints. This loop enables you to make adjustments. I'd like to go through step by step and talk about the benefit of isolating components. I'll also share patterns you can adopt to make that process smoother and ensure that you're shipping high quality UIs. Let's start with design. These days, UIs have multiple dimensions of complexity. They have to be responsive, accessible, support multiple color modes like dark and light, allow for user personalization, respond to the application state to show different variations, and then you layer on the complexity of asynchronous tasks, which require things like loading and error states. To manage that complexity, we use components. I trust I don't need to explain components to you. Components are great, but using components themselves don't magically solve all of our problems. Take this card component, for example. It has 4 different variations based on application state. So far, so good. Did you notice that they're all in dark mode? You know what comes next. We need light mode designs too. So we add those, and now we're up to 8 variations. And then you account for viewport sizes, localization, all the nitty-gritty details of design systems work. Now we're up to dozens and dozens of variations. You have to account for all those variations when designing UI components. So how do you keep up? In design land, we create sticker sheets to manage that complexity. It's a grid of components and their variations, so we can see every possibility for a component in one place. Building out these sticker sheets of variants is a relatively straightforward process in design tools. Many design tools literally have a concept of variants built in. This is great for designers, but what about developers and other team members? The variants we design with also act as the foundation for both handoff, the next step in our loop, and development. Things are a bit trickier when it comes to coding components and their variants. It doesn't often make sense to produce component variations in random places throughout your app. Sometimes it's not even possible. You could manually create coded sticker sheets for each component, then build out pages in your app, or make a whole separate app just for them. Or you could just use Storybook. Storybook gives you sticker sheets for your coded components. It does a lot more than that, but let's start with the sticker sheets. Storybook is the place for your coded component variants. It lets you detach the component from your app. Then each variation of those components can be easily cataloged and available for quick reference. Storybook is called that because it's built up of stories. A story is essentially all the information required to render a particular UI state. For example, these are all the prop values for the default variant of the restaurant card component. Each of the variants in a sticker sheet translate into a story. Stories are a powerful concept. They can do a lot. And the superpowers I mentioned at the start, they come from using stories. The first superpower of stories is pretty fundamental. They allow you to instantly navigate to that particular state. Once you have one story for a component, it's easy to tweak or build upon that story to create more and one for each variant. Then, during development, you can instantly jump to any of those stories to see what the component looks like in that exact state. If we weren't using Storybook and we were instead developing components in an app, we'd need to start up the app, navigate to the page we're working on, and sometimes even perform some interactions to get to the state we need. Stories make all of that invisible. You just open the story. Components aren't only affected by their props, though. They can be themed, change with viewport sizes, and have different localizations. You can write stories to accommodate all of those configurations too. With Storybook, you can embed your design file right next to the story it's designed for. Devs have easy access to the spec while they're building components and can stay in sync with designers. All right, so your component is designed and we've built it out in code. It accounts for every state we can think of. Now, how do you make sure it keeps working as it should? We have to write tests. That's the second superpower of stories. Stories are your test cases for everything a component does. So by writing stories, you've already written out your test cases for these variants. So if stories are tests, how do you run those tests? That's kind of what Chromatic does. It converts your stories into UI tests. One of the core services that Chromatic offers is visual regression testing. Chromatic renders each story in a cloud browser and takes a snapshot. It then compares that snapshot to a previously accepted baseline and notifies you of changes. When Chromatic finds visual differences, the developer is notified to approve or reject that change. In some situations, a component's state is based on user interaction. For example, this restaurant detail page component flow allows you to add an item from the menu to the cart where the side panel is only visible after clicking a button. For these kind of scenarios, we need to interact with the component before we take a snapshot or assert on other details. We could jump to writing unit or integration tests, which is totally possible with stories. And I've seen it done a lot of times. But when a test fails, all you get to debug is a blob of HTML in the console. Even though tools like Testing Library are doing their best, I don't have the brain power to parse HTML into something visual in my mind. Debugging UIs using CLIs is clunky. It's like playing a text adventure game on your PS5. We can do better. So why not use the stories? We took the best tool in the industry, Jest, Testing Library, and Playwright, and created browser-based component testing, or what we call interaction testing. It's currently one of my favorite superpower of stories because it's so nice to have your stories and tests together. Looking at that add to cart flow I showed you earlier, we can write a test for it that runs right in the browser. And to write an interaction test, you attach a play function to a story. A play function is a snippet of code that runs after a story is rendered. Think of it like the script for the interaction you need. You can also do your own assertions in a play function. See the expect call in the code there? The cool thing is, since the test runs in the browser, debugging is easier too. You get Storybook and DevTools, not a screenshot or a video. You can jump to the step that is failing and pop open the DevTools to inspect the UI. You can easily step back and forth between the stages of the test to gain further understanding of the issue. Interaction tests automatically run in Chromatic in addition to your visual tests, and it waits for the play function to finish running before capturing a snapshot. So you can do things like test the appearance of a dialogue after it's been opened. And when an interaction test fails in Chromatic, we'll show you exactly how, with a detailed error and a screenshot of that moment. But that's not the best part. When investigating a failure, you can launch a deployed version of the Storybook that was built for that exact version of the component. It'll automatically link you to the failed story at the exact failed step in the interaction. And from there, you debug in the browser, just like you would with local development. Another area of testing is accessibility checks. While developing, you can use the Storybook accessibility add-on. It highlights accessibility violations while you code, showing you what rules are violated and which ones passed, how you can fix it, and exactly which elements are involved. Chromatic is adding accessibility testing soon. Until then, we also have a tool called the Test Runner, which is part of Storybook, and it automatically turns your stories into tests and runs those tests using a headless browser. And the result of those tests are reported in the CLI or via reporting tools like Istanbul. That means you can automate those tests, including accessibility checks, in your CI. Here's a quick example of how to use it to run accessibility checks. It uses Axe under the hood, and you can configure your checks and stories to ignore particular violations if you need. All right, so we've designed, developed, and backed it with automated tests. That lets us be confident that any future updates won't break existing features. But what about new or changed features? How do we know that we've made the right changes? You ask your team, which brings us to the last step of the loop, the review process. And just to be clear, review doesn't just happen at the end. Requirements churn, scope creep, swoop, and poop, they're all pretty common in UI engineering. There's usually a lot of unpredictability. Despite our best efforts, we often discover new states or hit roadblocks. So, how do you track those changes and ensure that both engineering and design are involved in the decision making? Devs rely on version control like GitHub to track changes to the code. This allows them to receive feedback in consistent and expected ways. When they're ready to get that feedback, they open up a pull request and assign other devs to review the associated code. This allows folks to maintain code quality and coordinate changes. UI review, another Chromatic feature, complements that workflow by allowing you to assign designers to review the rendered UI change for that pull request. This brings power back to design. Designers get to validate all those changes. It works like this. When a developer opens a pull request, Chromatic indexes all the components and stories within that pull request and uploads them to a shared cloud workspace. Then you assign designers, product managers, and other stakeholders to review the rendered UI. Now Chromatic knows exactly what part of the UI has changed. So reviewers know precisely what they need to review. Just like GitHub only shows you the change code to review, Chromatic only shows you the UI that changed. Excuse me. Reviewers can provide the feedback on the UI changes, and Chromatic provides a dedicated UI to review each component and its stories. You can just compare the snapshots, or you can open up the deployed Storybook to play with it in the browser. And they can attach comments to a specific story. All change requests get tracked as a checklist for the developer to work through. And once the reviewer is happy with all of the changes, they can mark it as approved and the dev can continue with the rest of the PR process. We finished the loop. We may have to go around for a few cycles sometimes, but we've gone through all the steps. But inevitably, things change over time. How do we all, designers, developers, project managers, system users, and contributors, stay in sync? Documentation. That's the final superpower of stories I'll share today. Storybook can build out a docs page for each component with previews, the real thing, not images, for all your stories, source code for those previews so people can see how to use it, props table with controls to modify the story, and when you do, the source code changes to match. Add your own description to the component and say how they can and should use your component. Here's an example. Let's say we have a button component with a primary story. We can add a JS comment above the story to change the description. And we can further configure how a story is documented using parameters, a storybook concept for configuring stories, components, and the project. Here, we set the docs.canvas.source state parameter to show the normally hidden story source. When the automatic documentation isn't enough, you can also write completely custom docs pages using Markdown or MDX. MDX is Markdown that also supports React components. You can render any HTML or React component you want. I love using it for things like nicely formatted best practices or do's and don'ts. And those stories get automatically documented and are easy to reference in your custom MDX too. So you can continue reusing that work. Once you've adjusted your documentation just right, you can publish your storybook to make it easy to share with others on your team. Each story has its own URL, which makes it really great for sharing precisely the variation of the component you need to talk about. Now, in this audience especially, I think we'd all agree that docs are great, but it'd be even better to put those stories of production-coded components right next to the design. We've already seen that while we're developing, we can reference design files next to the stories in Storybook. With Chromatic, we can go the other way, and we put your stories inside of Figma while you're designing. We call it the Storybook Connect plugin. Since stories are one-to-one with variants, the plugin lets you connect the two and view live stories right inside Figma, and they stay linked as you approve new baselines in Chromatic, and they update in Figma. One more thing about Storybook before we wrap things up here. Storybook 8 was released on Monday. You should give it a try. It's pretty awesome. It has one really great feature, the Chromatic Visual Tests add-on. Everything I told you about visual tests can now be done directly within Storybook, instead of going to the Chromatic app or even setting up CI. My favorite part is how after you run a build to see what changed, it highlights the changed stories in the sidebar. And also, I don't have to wait for a lengthy CI time to get this visual feedback. That was a lot, really quickly. So let's take a moment to recap the entire workflow. We start with design, which gets handed off to developers. They build those components in isolation using Storybook. In doing this, you'll have captured all component states and variations as stories. Chromatic then uses those stories as test cases. Chromatic gets triggered when you open a pull request. Then devs review the UI test and ensure that they're all passing. Meanwhile, UI reviews is used to capture quality feedback and get sign-off. And the stories linked in Figma are updated using the published Storybook. Checks from Chromatic are reported via PR badges. If all the checks pass, you're ready to ship. This variant-driven approach that I shared has several benefits. You have less context switching, so folks can use the tools they feel most comfortable with. Whether you're comfortable in design tools or a code editor, you can access both designs and coded components in the same tool. You get timely feedback and sign-off. Designers don't have to feel powerless once development starts, and they remain involved in the process, and then you can catch accidental changes. It's impossible to run manual checks for your entire component library, so most teams don't bother, but automated visual testing makes it much easier to catch those bugs. Okay, I have to confess something. We actually skipped a step in this workflow, deciding what to work on in the first place. That's where Omlet comes in, which I'll let Adam explain next.
What a transition. Thank you, Ruben. So like what Ruben was just mentioning, he talked a lot about how you can implement changes in a design system, but how do you know which or what design system changes to make? And so we work with a lot of design system teams. And early on, we talked with this one team. And this team told us a story about how they created their design system. And this is a pretty common story that we hear quite a bit. And what they envisioned that their design system would be a cornerstone of consistency, efficiency, innovation across all of their products. And to them, those creating the design system, the benefits were so obvious. Like, of course, everyone would be really excited to use it. And so the design system team, they poured everything they had into this design system. They launched it. But what they noticed after they launched the design system is that features, new product features were being launched with custom components. In fact, there were so many custom components that they talked to the dev team, and the dev team ensured them, no, we're using the design system. But they weren't really seeing, the teams weren't really seeing these awesome, obvious benefits. So there's nothing nefarious in this story, but this is a very common story that we hear over and over again, that it turns out that some of the dev teams were using the design system some of the time. And the teams that were using the design system heavily, they were shipping faster. So no surprise, the teams that were using the design system were actually seeing the benefits. But the question is like, how do you actually know that? How do you know who's using the design system? Which components are actually being used? And why is all of this so hard? Well, it's kind of like, it's just like with a website. If you have a website, you put Google Analytics on it. Right? If you have a design system, you need component analytics. You need design system analytics. And that's why we built Omlet. Omlet gives you visibility into how your components are used in production. And then once you have visibility, you can start making some data-informed decisions. So let me give you an example of how teams are using this. Right? There's several main use cases, and I'm sure many of you have gotten an ask from leadership of like, hey, how's the design system going? Or how is it being used? Or maybe the most challenging of all, what's my ROI on the design system? See, leadership likes to be able to see progress over time. So with Omlet, you can see how your adoption of the design system progresses at a high level. Like overall, of all of my code in production, how much of it is using the design system versus how much is using custom components? What's really interesting is that many times, even for companies that think they have really high usage of their design system, after their first scan, they'll often be surprised that they're at around 20%. And they had no idea. It's like building this great house, but you haven't moved in yet. Now, once you get top level, adoption visibility, you need visibility at the component level. Which components are used the most? Which design system components are used the most, which are used the least? And even what's my most used non-design system components? We don't just care about design system components, but I want to know what are the components that aren't a part of the design system? What are the components that maybe you're not supposed to be using? And your first reaction may be to try and remove any non-design system components. But what if that data actually gives you insights into what areas you need to improve on next? So understanding where and how these components are used can then give you an idea of gaps in your component library capabilities. In a recent example, we were talking with a company and we were looking at their scans and what components were being used. And there was a ton of like setting modal custom components. They were all really similar. And what they realized was they didn't have like a settings modal as a part of the official design system. So teams were creating it themselves. And there was 3 different settings modals that were all kind of doing the same thing to cover the use cases across all their apps. It helps prioritize, it helped them prioritize, hey, maybe this is something that we should tackle next. Now, you have that visibility at the component level, but of course, each component has props. And you need visibility into what props are being used on each component and how many times those props are used. A major cause of bugs and UX issues are on misused props. And I'm sure, thinking back to what Ruben was talking about, he had a whole section on like visual regressions and bugs. And I bet you could track most of that back to misused props. Like in this button component example here, it has a color prop. And there's your, default error warning. But for some reason, subtle is being used as an option. It's being used once. That's not an official option in terms of color for this button. So depending on your code, this may cause an error, or it could give you some insights into what you should add. Maybe someone's using maybe the subtle color is used on other components within your design system, but it's not used on props, and it would make sense that it should be. Right? So it can give you some insights maybe we should do something here. Now, let's say I update that button component, or maybe I find a component and I want to deprecate it. The next question is how is this going to affect my team? Because we all know components are all connected. So once you identify issues in your component implementation and decide to make those changes, the next step is to make these changes without causing any bugs or disrupting anyone else. And so we've seen design system teams face this challenge. And what it does is it causes them to be more conservative when making changes, which is kind of a way to say it causes them to slow down. Because if you don't know what happens when I make this change, what else it's going to affect, you're just not going to work as fast. So using a dependency graph, our dependency graph visualization, you can see what other components are directly or indirectly affected by changes to a particular component. Now, in IDEs, we can easily get the usages of components for their direct parents. But what about those components that are indirect? Or let's say you have a multi-repo setup. How can we find where a component is used across the repository? So dependency tree shows this problem by giving you the consolidated dependency information in a hierarchical way. So with this information, you have a clear idea of which projects, pages, teams, components are going to be affected by a change. Now, we know that if you use the design system, you'll see benefits. That's obvious. But now what you want to be able to do is break it down by which team and which projects are using the design system. So you can use this data to find things like find out which barriers are being, what barriers are there at like an adoption level, at a team level. So for instance, maybe there's issues with the design system that you didn't realize. Like you're not served in the same way that a product, right? A design system's a product. Maybe there's a certain area of your design system that's not serving the needs for some particular reason. Maybe it's workflow related. Maybe it's operationally related. Maybe there's some documentation issues that you weren't aware of, like that subtle example. Or you can track across versions. So let's say some teams are using V1 of the design system and some teams are using V2. You need to transition everyone to V2. Which teams are doing it and how is it progressing? You can also identify why certain teams are more successful in using the design system and then replicate that across other teams. You may also see that overall adoption data is skewed because of one overarching team. So this team level and project level view is super important. So we know that design systems have a lot of benefits, but many teams, they're not seeing the full benefits. But the problem here is it's actually worse. When you're not fully utilizing your design system, you're effectively managing two design systems: the design system itself, which takes work to maintain, and then the non-design system, which takes a different approach to maintain. So you've exponentially increased your surface area for errors, slowdowns, and bottlenecks. Now, there's several ways you can solve for this. One of which, and this is what most companies are doing right now, is they iterate blindly. I hope you have you better hope you have a really great testing environment like Chromatic. This is like the only way you can do it, is if you have a lot of time, you have a great testing environment, you're using Storybook and Chromatic, right? This is like must. The second thing that people try and do is, hey, well, why don't we build this ourselves? Let's build a custom analysis system. So what that means is let's take a dev off the design system. It's going to take about 50% of their time. If they start from scratch, if you start now, it's going to take 6 to 9 months. And there's the opportunity cost of what else could they be doing. Plus, you're dependent on this engineer to maintain it. If they get pulled off to another project, fire drill, leave the company, it's all for nothing. Plus, a lot of times these custom solutions end up being like the lowest common denominator, the MVP. We're working with a couple, these are like top 10 companies in terms of market cap size on this right now. And they have a custom solution, which is Excel with some checkboxes and some numbers. Right? So even companies that have large, a ton of money, ton of people, you end up with this a pretty simple solution. Or, and this is a new space, but you can go with a dedicated design system tool and components analytics solution. Right? Now, what's really neat here is that the data you need to solve this problem, it's there already. It's in the code. It's in your source code. But it's not easy to reveal when you have to do things manually. And so that's where Omlet comes into place. That's why we built Omlet, because we realized that, one, a lot of teams weren't realizing the full benefits of their design system, and two, they didn't know why. They didn't have any visibility into it. So what Omlet does is it gives you visibility into which components are being used, aren't being used, and where. You can then use all that data to inform your strategy with insights, how you communicate, how you educate certain groups, which changes you're going to make, how you optimize your design system. And then, of course, you can track this progress over time. And so you can start to measure the success of your design system. Omlet is free to try. It's super easy to set up. It takes like 5 minutes to get your first scan done. So you can start seeing, it's really interesting after you do your first scan. So you can see which components are being used and where are they being used. When you see it for the first time, it's like eye-opening. But Joseph here, Joseph is with Persona. And he's the real hero of our story here. He's using all this stuff. So what I'd like to do is now pass it over to Joseph, and he can chat more about how he's doing all this.
Thanks, Adam. Share my screen here. So yeah, I'm Joseph. I'm a design engineer at Persona. In my free time, I like to DJ. I'm an F1 fan. That's me with my partner in Vegas. I'm an avid amateur home chef. I like to make yakitori pizza, breakfast tacos. And I'm going to be telling you exactly what Adam said, how I bring all these tools together into my not so secret recipe, the amplifying design system impact. I had this slide when we did this presentation in person, but now that I realize the slide may not hit for the worldwide audience if you're not familiar with In-N-Out. But In-N-Out is like our burger chain here in California. It's world famous, and they have this secret sauce. But really, it's like not so secret. It's just Thousand Island dressing, which is really popular dressing. But they put on everything. And just like how everyone kind of knows the secret sauce at In-N-Out, you kind of already know how to put together, an awesome design system. It's really like, it's not so much about like the secret ingredients, but more about how you put everything together. So I came from Workday, working on Canvas, huge scale. You see that little blue dot in the bottom left corner, that's me. Last time I checked, Workday probably had around, I don't know, 18,000 employees. And when I was there, we had maybe 15 folks working on Canvas alone. There were engineers dedicated to Canvas, designers, researchers. We had content people dedicated to just the Canvas team. We had accessibility experts. We even had users who directly use Canvas that were not Workday employees to build like Workday like extensions and applications. And the design org was like 200 people, millions of users. Persona is a little bit different. Let me get into a little bit about what Persona does. We're not a design tool like my other awesome co-hosts here. We are actually an identity verification solution. So really everything you need to work with identity for your users. If you know the terms like KYC, KYB, we're exactly that. Navigating identity is tricky. We provide you with the tools to do all that. For example, if you open up an account with a bank or something, you may need to verify your ID. That's where folks interface with us first, with Persona first. Our customers implement our SDK, and they can verify their users' identities. And we make it all smooth. The scale is definitely much different than Workday. Compared to Workday's design org of 200 people, Persona in total is 200 people, half of whom are full stack engineers, and there's one full-time design engineer owning the design system, and that's me. Little blue dot, but less dots to be among. Product landscape here, it's young, it's fairly evolving all the time. And even the brand is still iterating. Like coming down the pipe this year or maybe next year, I already know that we have a brand refresh coming through, and that will probably put it at the design system to the test. Rolling out a brand refresh in a seamless fashion, which brings me to my first point, which is meeting your design systems users where they're at. In other words, like truly understanding what your users need and how to best serve them. When I came from Workday to Persona, different environment, I came in having a plan, right? I thought I had all this knowledge from Workday. I thought I was going to roll out this awesome, kind of like a mirror copy of Canvas at Persona. I was going to really teach this little startup, what a real design system looks like. Documentation, processes. Those are all the things I did within my first 100 days. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. One thing that really worked was just honestly talking to people and understanding what they needed. So like literally talking to every front-end engineer as well as designer at Persona. I have the luxury of kind of knowing everyone that uses my design system. You may not have that luxury at a bigger company, but you can still try, set up conversations. I'm sure you already do. But they really give me a good pulse of what's going on in the product landscape. Working on a design system, even for a small company, you end up being in your own space a little bit sometimes. But talking to people just helps you break out of that. Moving on to a little bit about our stack of Persona. Everyone's stack looks different, but here at Persona, most of our product engineers are full stack engineers, which means they're like mostly in Ruby on Rails land, and some of them lean more on front end than others. But really, like all of them, they're just trying to push out UI and they want to be confident in, and be confident in like that designer signed off on it, that they look good, that they function well. Really, they want to translate designs from Figma with ease. I mean, I guess everyone wants to do that. But you got to know your engineers and how they work today, what tools that they use, and what skills that they're best at. An analogy I like to make, when creating a design system is that this Lego box that you buy, you can buy like a giant Lego box with all these different pieces, and technically you can build, I don't know, like a spaceship. But sometimes you just want to know that you'll end up at something awesome. And so, same thing kind of goes with like design system. Maybe for your organization, it may make sense to make everything super atomic that can be composed in however many fashions you want. But for some organizations, it's better to just ship something that your users can use in a specific way to deliver the experience that you want. It may not work for everyone, but it's all about understanding who your users are. mapping this to a more concrete example in a component, I suppose. Back when I started a couple years ago at Persona, I thought like the atomic fashion would be the way to go, and then I'll just leave it up to our engineers to figure it out how to compose them. I thought it'd be great to like kind of split off a generic trigger for a menu. It ended up being pretty confusing though. So fast forward like a year or two later, kind of switched it off into a more prescribed approach that worked better for our engineers. And so now today we just ship a drop-down menu instead of like this trigger that kind of abstracted things a little bit far away. My second secret ingredient is to ask yourself, what is design system work? Like I mentioned before, sometimes we're in kind of this walled garden working on design systems. But what are we really trying to achieve exactly? Like what will move the needle in terms of, delivering a better experience? I'm sure like these two kind of principles are part of your design systems as well. But I want to emphasize that it's not just consistency in your design system, and it's not just quality in your design system. It's actually we're really trying to achieve here is consistency for all of your UI and quality for all of your users. And so sometimes it's not enough to just build this big and best design system possible. You have to get down and dirty sometimes. That was a big culture shift, coming from Workday to this small organization. At Workday, we kind of relied more on like evangelism. Sometimes we would consult and jump in and get a little bit dirty with UI. But for the most part, it was like building the best documentation and like kind of setting up meetings and talking to people. Here at Persona, I have, the ability to touch every part of the UI. And so you got to leverage what you got, and so sometimes I'm just going in and getting dirty and replacing components. I'm not saying it's like a scalable thing to do, but at this scale, it works. It's good to think about the long term, but also you got to consider what you need to do to get things done and set a foundation today. And so this is what my day-to-day looks like at Persona. Obviously, bread and butter, crafting, documenting components. That's what you all do and are familiar with. I also like to create Figma plugins and like get my hands dirty with like pipelines and tools. For example, a big thing I did at Workday was just like creating a pipeline for icons. I don't know if you've ever worked with icons, but they're very tricky, exporting SVGs in a format that works for like all browsers. And if you want to color them, that's like another layer. So one of the plugins I made, which we'll see in a bit, is one to help our designers go through that process. Another thing I do, refactoring code, just replacing components myself sometimes. That's how I kind of establish like the best practice of using a component. And you also learn a lot when you use your own design system components. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but it's all good information, to better your design system. And I also think beyond the design system itself. The design system at Persona is a collection of very atomic components like buttons, etc. But the design system is not the only shared library at Persona. There's specific product libraries for our dashboard product. And so it's good to keep a pulse on that and help organize that as well. Because if you think about the end-to-end developer experience for your organization, it likely looks the same. Like you can pull components from kind of a more local library, and then you can pull components from a design system library as well. And so you need to understand kind of like the end-to-end, see where you can fit in the best. And again, the final one is championing best practices for the front end. It's especially important here at Persona since I'm pretty much the only person who's fully focused on front end. 100% of the time. But for many organizations as well, like the rest of the company kind of looks to the design system often to push like the best standards for front end, like accessibility. It usually comes the leadership usually comes from the design system, because if you can make your design system components accessible, then in theory the rest of your application should level up as well. My last secret ingredient, which is kind of a shout out to my time at Workday when I was a design technologist, is to get creative, be technologist. Technologist is kind of like a loaded word sometimes. It means different things to different companies, but in general, let's just use the Webster dictionary definition, which is really like just think forward and taking advantage of what's available today, and maybe pushing the future a little bit. For example, I mentioned going in and replacing things myself. I don't do all of that manually. There are things like, code mods, which is really nasty to write, to be honest. But honestly, the secret here is to just use ChatGPT. It is a life changer. You can start there and like edit it later, but this allows me to push through, huge PRs that are relatively simple. If we were just updating button size names, it's a simple like mapping, like bumping up and down. It may get a little more complicated with all the components, but we've done it here and there. It's like I use code mods to get myself maybe 85% of the way, and then I'm okay with doing the rest manually. And again, this is kind of a luxury we have here at Persona, given the code base is still manageable. It's large, but it's still like manageable. So every so often, my fellow engineers here at Persona have to review a massive PR, like 300 files. And then the next tool is Chromatic. So, working on design systems, I don't always, like the only way I can confidently deliver massive changes like 300 files is to use something like Chromatic to review all the snapshots that we take. We don't snapshot every piece of UI here, but we snapshot at least the most important flows, obviously all the design system components, and that's really the only way that I can tell what changes go through. When I change something as crucial as like a button size, I can go through and review everything one by one, and sometimes I ask my other engineers to spot check things on Chromatic, or I can just go through it myself and kind of visually diff everything that changes when I make such a core change in the design system. And then this was something I built a little while back as well. I sent it over to actually my account manager at Chromatic. But I just needed to know, I needed some metrics on how my design system was being used, like the adoption, obviously, like which components were most popular. Obviously, Omlet does this way better, and you don't have to maintain it. Even when I was starting, putting together that dashboard myself, it was a little nasty, to be honest. But it was something like we needed absolutely, getting metrics, just to see if I was actually moving the needle. That's always a super hard thing to do. Even at Workday, it was like hard to quantify the impact, especially at an organization that large. And then the final one, which is probably like one of my favorite thing to do is like just create Figma plugins. Here at Persona, we actually have 200 people, right? We actually have like 3 plugins. One of them is public. It's just like a thing to migrate style dictionary JSON over to Figma variables. And another thing is I mentioned like icons, just a linter for all the icon stuff. And the final one is one for dev mode. And so, all these Figma plugins, they allow me to do less like the manual checking with like manual importing, allows designers to self-serve a little bit, as well as engineers. The dev mode plugin helps them map obviously components over to actual component code. So definitely leverage what you have at your disposal. There's so many avenues you can take advantage of. If you want to use AI, sure, use AI, but you don't have to use AI. You can just create a Figma plugin that is very, like, it may not be something you can share out to the community, but it can help your community at your company. So to recap, meet your design systems users where they're at. Ask yourself, what does design system work? And finally, get creative and be technologists. These are my 3 secret ingredients, and you already know them. It's nothing new. But again, it's all about how you put together your formula and what works for your company. Only you know your company, your organization best. And so pick and choose what you pick up over the years, at these webinars, and at future ones. So thanks. That's all I have for you today, and feel free to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. We have a couple minutes here left. I want to take some time to answer some of the questions that came in. We've already been answering them in the Q&A. So if you ask a question, feel free to check there. We've already got some answers for you. I see a couple here. If we want, oh, Veronique, she already found it. I think this question was for Joseph, share the link to your Figma plugin for style dictionary to variables. Yeah, that was for Joseph. If you guys want to come back, show your faces in case we do have any questions here, so you could chime in yourselves. Yeah, any other questions from the audience? We have a couple minutes left here. Again, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us. And yeah, taking the time today. Oh, here's another question now. There was mention about design system adoption percentage. Is there an average you've seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think something to keep in mind. So there's 2 things here. One is adoption just for the sake of adoption shouldn't be the ultimate goal. So it's not like you'll never really get to 100%, just because the kind of the nature of design systems and products and teams, and that's okay. I don't think you ever really want to get to 100%, but you certainly don't want to be at 10% either. So oftentimes what we see is when teams first do their scan, it's quite low, and they're surprised by like, oh, I didn't realize it was that low. But the next question isn't like, oh, well, it was at 20 or 30%. We need to get that to 90, and here's my plan to get it to 90. That shouldn't be the next step, because just getting adoption for the sake of adoption isn't important. What's more important is which teams are using it, how are they using it, which components are they using, what's our goal. Like if we're transitioning from V1 to V2, adoption is much more important for that, right? Like that use case versus we need to make sure that everyone's using it everywhere all the time, and we're not going to ship anything without it, because then that causes other problems like, hey, maybe we actually slow things down because the design system isn't going to cover 100% of all use cases. So on the low range, yeah, like 20, 30%, but maybe in some cases, right? It's in some cases, is that okay? Maybe that's okay, but it depends on everyone. Some teams are happy with 60, 70%, and they're totally fine with that. It just kind of depends on your situation. The most important piece is now I can actually see it and make decisions based on it. So that's the important part.
Awesome. Yeah. We have 1 minute left here. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Adam for answering that last live question there, and Joseph for sharing the plugin there. Yeah, we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. If you haven't checked out Omlet, please do so. It's free. You can try it for 30 days, scan, get insights. And if you have any questions about Chromatic or Storybook, yeah, feel free to give it a try or book a demo there. Yeah.
Also, I'd like to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Nurhan and I do Storybook sessions that go much deeper into Storybook, like deep into add-ons and Storybook globals and viewports and all of that. If you want recordings, just share your email with someone here, and we'll get you the resources you need.
Yes, that's what we're all about sharing here. All right. Thank you all so much. See you in the next one. Take care.